Welcome back, everyone, and oh boy, it's been a while. Holy shit, this has been a busy week, so I haven't recorded pretty much anything. But yeah, you may have noticed that a few days ago, the Mongolia Progress Report was released by the Kaiserreich team, so that's what we're going over today. Now, no fancy graphics today, but we do have to speak about a few things first. Now, Mongolia is a weird country because it has a kind of nomadic history, and we are used to thinking about countries kind of in a Western style, but here we are speaking about a civilization that exists in the East, right, where China is a thing, and which projected its power across the steppes, right? So it's not exactly a nation state in the Western definition. And what we used to think of as Mongolia is not really like a nation, it's more like a collection of tribes that, I don't know, they're kind of just lumped in together in historical terms. Now, it's important to understand is that for a long part of its history, Mongolia was actually part of China in one way or another, either because it was the conqueror of China, or because it was a subject, or because it was part of the constituencies that made up what we call China, along with the Han or other ethnicities. And that's the case of the Qing, right? To not start like from too far back, and if you take a look at, you know, like obviously Wikipedia or whatever, I'm no expert on Mongolia. I've never read a book on like the history of Mongolia, so I do not really know like a lot. But the basics is that essentially, after the collapse of the Mongol Empire and all the Mongol empires that succeeded the Mongol Empire, including the Chinese Yuan Dynasty, which was both China and Mongolia at the same time, the Mongolians again fragmented into a bunch of different khanates, and all of these essentially fell under the sphere of influence of this one empire or the other, and you know, the few that remained independent eventually succumbed. And the most important one, obviously, the most important empire that expanded into Mongolia is the Ching Dynasty, for the pretty obvious reason that you can see in the map of the extension. The Qing ended up taking over the majority of what we call Mongol territories. So yeah, this is the premise. And in the Qing Dynasty, you can see from the 8-banner system and from the way the administration worked, that essentially the Mongols were a constituent part of the empire. They were obviously below the Manchus, just like the Han Chinese, but they were one of the 3 main ethnicities, the other 2 obviously being the Manchus and the Han Chinese. So yeah, the Mongols were an important part of the Qing Empire, both in terms of the administrative and military structures, and like this empire, right, which included Mongols, also fought against other Mongols, such as, if you take a look at the Jungar Khanate, or the I don't remember how to pronounce this. I've looked this up once, but I forgot. Which was a kind of Mongol empire. If you've played EU4, these guys are the successors of the Oirats, essentially. And they were crushed eventually by the Qing because supposedly, well, one, they occupied very valuable territory, and supposedly the Qing feared that they would ally with Russia, actually. So here you are introduced to the other driving force in Mongolian history. So that on the one side, there is the contact with China, and on the other side, especially for modern Mongolian history, you have the contact with Russia, which in the 16th and 17th century started to push east. This contact would lead to, you know, the emergence of pretty big contradictions over who would actually rule over Mongolia, because Mongolia, like, has been on a steady decline in terms of power because of its, because of its relative far distance. That's good English. Because of its relative distance from, all trade routes essentially, and because of its very low population and a bunch of other reasons, the nomadic Mongols could not keep up with expanding Chinese and Russian economies, which, while weak compared to other empires such as the British one, obviously overtook the Mongols, and the balance of power between the settled people and the nomads shifted in favor of the settled people. There's actually a really interesting book about all of this that's called The Frontier, which I will link obviously somewhere, by Owen Lattimore. And yeah, so essentially the Chinese on the one side and the Russians on the other at one point had to come to blows over Mongolia. And while there were many wars between the Ching Dynasty and Russia, like the big event that obviously kind of shook the old order in Mongolia, which at this point was a kind of integral part of the Chinese Empire, was obviously the 1911 revolution that took down the Qing dynasty, because it led to a declaration of independence of the existing power structure in Mongolia from the new Chinese Republic. Now, to fully explain what was going on over here, we'd have to get into some really complicated, really complicated mechanics of how, like, the Mongolian nobility and, Buddhism and the Chinese Empire worked together to maintain stability over Mongolia, but we don't have the time, and I don't have the skills, so we're gonna just completely not care about this. What follows in real life was a few struggles over Mongolia. Actually, this one should be like over here. A few struggles over Mongolia, which would eventually end up with the fight between the... so the Russians ended up backing Mongolian nationalists against the Chinese. The Chinese themselves were expelled eventually out of Mongolia, but then the Russians obviously had the Russian Civil War to deal with, so Mongolia became part of the power struggle between Soviet Russia and White Russia. And so a proxy war was fought in Mongolia between pro-white forces and pro-red forces. Eventually, the pro-red forces won. And during that whole mess, you have essentially the very brief rise and fall of the character that is the most important to the Kaiserreich Mongolia, and that is Herman Theodoric von Ungern-Sternberg, or Sternberg, who is obviously the Mad Baron of Mongolia. This guy is probably the biggest figure that we have to deal with when it comes to Kaiserreich Mongolia, the one that you all know and maybe love for his insanity. These other figures, I'm gonna link everything later. So IRL, he led this kind of band of Cossacks and mercenaries and all sorts of nasty people to support the Mongolian nationalists against both the Chinese and the Red, both the Red Russians and the pro-Red Mongolian nationalists, who were led by the Mongolian People's Party. This one, the man, the Mongol Ardin Nam. And eventually, because of the victory of the Red Army, they were able to support the man in overthrowing Sternberg, who tried to resist, and executed him and established the Mongolian People's Republic, which lasted until 1992, which was directly succeeded by modern Mongolia, the modern Mongolian Republic, and that's the end of that. During that whole period, Mongolia was a monarchy under the Bogd Khan, who was already kind of an important noble in the existing aristocracy, which hadn't been wiped out by the Chinese conquest back in the 1600s. This kind of aristocracy was just as much part of the Qing Empire as the imperial bureaucracy. So while you could say that Mongolia was part of China during that whole time, it was also separate because it maintained its own institutions. And part of those institutions were also the Buddhist sort of monasteries and the general Buddhist Church, I'm going to call it church even though it's not supposed to be called that, of Mongolia. Yeah, that had a really, really deep influence in the country because essentially, like, with the way that the Mongolian economy worked, essentially both the aristocracy and the monasteries kind of collaborated in controlling everything, and like even numerically Buddhist monks were very, very prominent. I read somewhere that it was like 1/3 of all Mongolians are monks at some point, but don't quote me on this figure because I've just read it somewhere and I remembered it because it's just so striking. And yeah, so essentially the Buddhist Church also had a really big influence. Now, in real life, this was stamped out later, obviously, by when Stalinism essentially entered Mongolia and purges were conducted. Here we go with the Buddhism. However, it wasn't removed completely because the influence was just so deep-rooted. And in the years, the Buddhist Church had been both used as a symbol of Mongolian nationalism, as a kind of Mongolian nationalist ideology, and as a pacifying tool on the part of the Qing ruling elite, especially the Yellow Hat School, which, the Yellow Church, it's called in this Wikipedia article, to maintain peace among the Mongols and kind of keep them in line. Because all the different varying regional groups of Mongols had their own different loyalties, right? And so the farther away from the Chinese center they were, generalizing, the more they were likely to try to break away and rekindle the flames of pan-Mongolism, aka the idea of, reuniting all the Mongols under one banner, and once again, setting Central Asia on fire, essentially. So, with that out of the way, with that ridiculously already too long introduction out of the way, we get to the Kaiserreich part. Obviously, the breakoff point is the Russian Civil War going the wrong way, and so, compared to history. So, what you have in Mongolia is that Roman von Ungern-Sternberg survived as the ruler of Mongolia through military might, and has managed to build himself up as a sort of both Russian and Mongol figure, right? So he has ties to Russia. You can see the Russian economic assistance modifier, the third one. Then you have that he's also like a spiritual figure in Mongolian Buddhism and the leader of the Mongols, right? And he's got the support of like the sort of both the Buddhist establishment and the Mongolian nobility. However, his power is waning because of Russia's sort of troubles, and the fact that obviously Mongolia is a nomadic society gives some pretty bad effects because, it's out of place with the modern world and stuff. The other factions that are at play are obviously the aristocracy, the Buddhists, and the People's Party, the Man, which, while have been defeated in their, insurgencies, they're still around and they're still trying to rebel and proclaim Mongolia's, Mongolia's revolution again, because what they want to do is they want to build Mongolia as a modern nation. So yeah, essentially these are the 4 big paths that you can go down, and you can see them in the focus tree. There's Ungern's Mongolia on one side, the democratic Mongolia, aka the Man Mongolia, the constitutional Mongolia, the nobility restoring sort of old Mongolia, and the Buddhists, going about their own way to make a new Mongolia without Russian influence and with traditional culture preserved, only again in their own way through Buddhism rather than through the power of the nobility. And then you have a very, very tiny tree for everything else. So Mongolia's very important paths are political rather than everything else, because again it's a nomadic culture, so everything that has to deal with them generally has to deal with whoever's better at murdering each other, and essentially who supports who. And then they can set everything on fire, which is, I'm sure, what everyone wants to play Mongolia for. So we're just going to go very, very quickly over the different factions of what they want to do, and then end it, because, again, I'm not really that big of an expert. So, an opportunity arises. So, essentially, when Kerensky dies in Russia, Ungern's friend, funnily enough, is gone, right? Because Russia's in chaos. And you see that you get an event called Chaos in the North, because essentially the support from the Russians is waning, and so it's difficult for Ungern to maintain control over the entire country. After that, a big event chain happens, where you have like rebellions everywhere, right? And then you have events that allow you to support one faction or the other. And from the outcome of those events, in this time, one faction may take power, then only a few days another one takes over. So essentially, with chaos overwhelming most of the country, the government must aim to keep the country together while balancing out the influence of opposing factions. So these factions fight it out. Every once in a while, someone takes over. Maybe someone else takes over. Who knows? It's chaos. No one understands what's going on. Eventually, after a while, Urga begins to settle a little, and the faction in power can start consolidating power in the focus tree. Each focus takes 7 days. So here you see this path, if Ungern is consolidating power, this path for the nobility to take over, this path for the democratic Mongolia, and this path for the Buddhists. So you can see that there's, like, these political paths are tiered, right? There's a first tier, which is the consolidation, and then there's the second tier, which is the either transformation of society or then, reforming of the old ways, and generally the carrying out of the programs of whoever is involved, right? And you can see this pattern repeating with all of the different factions. They're all structured this way, which is really, really interesting, actually, and kind of makes sense. It's a bit like Kaiserreich's American factions, sort of. So yeah, you do that. However, other factions can still oust them and start going down their own tree. Factions have only secured their control when they've taken the final focus in their part of the tree. So only if Ungern has taken Ungern secures power can he go down the rest and consider himself safe. At the same time, declaring constitutional monarchy, the aristocratic kingdom, and the theocratic state is going to be required for the other factions to feel safe and take everything else. So Ungern's Mongolia. It would be difficult for Ungern-Sternberg to be able to keep hold of his power in Mongolia because a lot of people hate him, some of the military fights against him, all that kind of stuff. The aristocrats will either be helping him or will be gone. The Buddhists will have lost its power, and the man will have been crushed. So again, his only allies are in the aristocracy. You can see that the focus tree is all about essentially what to do with the princes, because everyone else will just be murdered. And what he wants to do is that he is the candidate that, again, is about the Russian engagement, right? What happens with Russia? because the foreign policy with China and with everyone else is going to be handled through decisions, which I believe they say. However, with Russia, you can either have Russian friendship or we don't need Russia, which presumably is going to be about, you know, if Russia's taken over by like the Soviets or someone that Ungern just in general doesn't like, he's going to want to claim the Trans-Siberian Railway and go down essentially the path that he used to go down in Kaiserreich. He's still gonna proclaim like the second Khanate or whatever, the second Genghis Khan, but you know, whatever. It's basically the whole idea, and then it's also about like Ungern's cult of personality and aggressive militarization. So yeah, this is probably going to be one of the most fun paths. The other path that you can take with Russia is Russian friendship, which obviously, you know, has problems with internal stability because, you know, it would probably look like a Russian takeover of Mongolia, but whatever. So yeah, that's that. Let's see if there's anything else to really talk about. He has two aims: prepare Mongolia for war and to secure and centralize his power, which are very, very good goals, obviously, to have fun in Hearts of Iron. Blah, blah, blah. A very nomadic nation. Yeah, some people believe he is the reincarnation of the Buddhist god of war. And yeah, the policy on Russia. So in this dangerous time, it might be better to buddy up with this far stronger nation. However, perhaps it is time to throw off the Russian yoke for good. A main reason is that many Mongolians dislike Ungern because he is not Mongolian. Many they see him as a puppet of Russia. Perhaps it would be a better idea for Mongolia to go its own way. So yeah, that's Ungern-Sternberg, and that's essentially, you know, a little bit less ridiculous than the current Mongolia path for Kaiserreich, but it's essentially the same thing. Then you have the Mongolian Aristocracy. Now, the leader of the guy, I haven't actually brought that up, but the leader of the Mongolian aristocrats is literally the leader of Mengukuo from IRL. Where the frick is he? Yeah, there we go. Prince, I'm not gonna pronounce him, or Demchugdongrop, Demchignodrop. Why do you have to have such a long name? Anyway, also known as Prince De. Much better. Prince De is one of the leaders of the Mongolian aristocracy, obviously, and in real life, he ended up becoming a puppet of the Japanese, and the leader of, again, Mengjiang or Mengukuo, or whatever you want to call it. It had like 17 different names. Which was a Japanese attempt to sort of slice off Inner Mongolia from China. Now, let's get to this part. Okay, so Mongolia, let's see if I can find it anywhere. So Mongolia has an outer Mongolia and an inner Mongolia, right? Let's see. Now, these two terms are about, yeah, see, here is some, like, location of today's Mongols, right? You see that there's Mongolia, right? Some of them are in Russia, some of them are in Central Asia, and Xinjiang, those are the Dzungars, and the Oirats. And then there's, you know, main Mongolia, and a big part of Mongolia in China and Manchuria. Now, Mongolia historically is referred to as Outer Mongolia, because it's outside China. And the other one is referred to as Inner Mongolia because it's inside China. Okay? This was not a distinction that was really around during like the Qing Empire or anything like that. It's mostly just a distinction that is pertaining to the Republican period. And today's Inner Mongolia actually has more ethnic Mongols living in it than Outer Mongolia, so you can kind of guess as to the importance of this area in like Mongolian nationalist ideologies. So yeah, that's the background in real life of the prince guy. And obviously, like, the pan-Mongolism kind of thing was really heavily, fought against by China in real life, because China kind of sees Mongolia as an integral part of China, at least historically, not today, but, historically it did. And so, that was just an obvious way to stoke instability in China to, try to support Mongol power. Anyway, so in the Kaiserreich, the nobility is essentially interested in the status quo because they control, outside of the church, the nobility is by far the biggest power block in Mongolia. Now, obviously, they have differences belonging to different regions and different families that are going to try to murder each other most likely, but they're all kind of just on the same boat of not wanting the Russians, not wanting the Chinese, not wanting too much of the church, although they're not necessarily against Buddhism. They're in fact in favor of Buddhism. They just don't want the radical Buddhists. And they want to be able to still own the entire country, because that's how classes work. So yeah, and they're obviously quite traditionalistic, and probably what people are going to be mostly interested in for the aristocratic path is the Mongol identity, where they get to say that they are the great Mongolian state. Now, I'm pretty sure Mongolia would already be calling itself the Great Mongolian State, which was just the historical name for the 1911 state or Khanate that was created. But whatever. It was just the official name. So yeah, let's see if there's anything else. Encourage traditional Mongolian living, cut the frivolous spending. Unnecessary costs must be cut. Yeah, just the normal stuff. While Ungern tried to move more people into the cities, the aristocrats instead encouraged traditional Mongolian living, so nomadism. He also aims to militarize the nation not through aggressive industrial policies like Ungern, but instead through a mix of organizing small armies the aristocrats already have, and encouraging a new wave of Mongol nationalism. So essentially, just promoting the traditional organizations that allowed the Mongols historically to be really, really strong, but and punch above their weight. Although obviously, this doesn't exactly work in real life, but it's gonna be fun to rove over, Asia with that. Next up are Social Democrats, the Revolutionaries. So after two previous failed revolutions, finally the men have achieved success under the leadership of Danzan. Now, in real life, the main leader of the revolutionaries initially was Sukbatar. Where the hell is he? There we go. This guy. But there were other important leaders, such as A. Danzan and S. Danzan. I believe S is, Solin Danzan. Here we go, this guy. Then there were other important Mongol revolutionary leaders, all of whom are, pretty documented around here, with Soviet support. The other big one that comes up later is Choibalsan, Mongolia Stalin, but I don't think he plays a role in the Kaiserreich Mongolia, so we're not going to even care about that. And they formed Mongolia's first political party, which is the Man. The Man wasn't necessarily a communist party at the beginning. It was a nationalist revolutionary party. It was essentially China's KMT, although since Mongolia's KMT. Although since Mongolia obviously was much weaker than China and mostly dependent on the Soviet Union for economic support, it was turned into a member of the Communist International, the Comintern, and later a puppet of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. under Stalin. So yeah, that's what they did. And they established the Mongolian People's Republic. Now, because of the different geopolitical landscape and Russian political landscape, the influence for the man is not the Social Democratic Workers' Party, like in real life, but it is the Socialist Revolutionaries and the Mensheviks. So they are in favor of sort of liberalizing the country and getting a liberal democracy that's, you know, sort of vaguely leftists, but not really outright socialist revolutionary. And they're still nationalists, and essentially their end goal is a constitutional monarchy. So they're less radical than real life, and their economic policies are going to be different. In real life, eventually they ended up being sort of influenced into adopting collectivization, just like in the Soviet Union. So yeah. Anyway, the man will try to move Mongolia to a democratic nation, with the Khan essentially acting as a figurehead without the ability to exert actual power. The man will also aim to quickly redistribute, which, by the way, was also what happened before 1924. From 1921 to 1924, there was a kind of there was a monarchy figurehead, just like in China in a similar period, only to be later, you know, abolished and the republic to be proclaimed. The man will also aim to quickly redistribute the wealth held by the aristocrats to the rest of the population. The Arats, the cattle herders, and the laborers are by far the largest social group in Mongolia, yet they hold next to no real power. This is the fault of the nobility, and therefore their wealth must be seized and distributed to the peasants who need it the most. Yeah, here we go. However, they get some big issues like immediately. So essentially, if you take a look at the focus tree, so they do all of that. They seize the wealth, they kill Ungern, all that stuff. However, there is a coup, and from that, the man splits into three parties. One part stays as the man, which can either sort of, you know, remove like the democratic pretensions and enact a kind of political tutelage and one-party rule, which is the man's self-coup path, or it can allow elections and then have either man come out on top, you know, stay in power, a new conservative party called the Khan to essentially become the new party of the nobles, or the MLN, which are the liberals, take charge. So yeah, you can have fucking glorious market liberal Mongolia. I'm not sure if market liberal or, well, from the icon it looks social liberal, which to me is just extremely sad, because I would just fucking love market liberal anarcho-capitalist Mongolia spreading the free market and the rule of you know, yeah, the rule of the free market all throughout Asia, from, you know, from the fucking horseback. It would just be so great. Yeah, I don't know, man, people just aren't fun. The Kaiserreich developers, they're not fun. And the last path are the radical Buddhists, the Budin Zövlul, or however you're supposed to pronounce this horrible word. So Buddhism essentially entered Mongolia something like 15th century, I think. Must be something around that time. And eventually became the main religion, and in specific it was Tibetan Buddhism. Now, in case you don't know, Buddhism has like a million different divisions, right? But Tibetan Buddhism is the one that obviously is most well known, and this is the one that took over in Mongolia. Although versions of it again differ from time to time, like you know, the Ching proposed their own version. Obviously, Sternberg also has his own version. And the Buddhist Church has a really complicated hierarchy that I have no idea how it works, so I'm not going to try to get into it. And Buddhist religious figures reincarnate, right? So to add to the confusion of ridiculously complicated names, ridiculously complicated institutions, ridiculously complicated ideological influences and social influences, you also have that all these guys reincarnate and are like the 9th, the 10th, blah 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 blah. So no one knows what the fuck's going on. So the official ruler, the 9th Jepsundama Kutuku, is the third most important person in the Tibetan Buddhism. Already this sentence might be in like Cthulhu speak, and that I would, about understand the same as, the sentence itself. However, although Ungern praised Buddhism and practiced it himself, he was never a true Buddhist. Although in real life, he practiced it, but obviously he wasn't exactly, an orthodox Buddhist, because he was a weird guy. Anyway, over the years he grew power hungry. Many feared he would not properly bring up the Khan, essentially, and would keep the power for himself. The Buddhist were a council formed with the intent of making sure that Buddhism is protected from power-hungry tyrants like him. Now, they're, as far as I know, the only completely fictional organization and group that exists in Kaiserreich Mongolia. I don't think that these people were real at all, but they're cool because, fucking radical Buddhists murder everyone who's not a Buddhist. What's wrong with that? If able to seize power, they aim to turn Mongolia into a fully Buddhist theocracy. Because, yes, they're led by the 7th Chankya Kutuku. Again, that Kutuku word, I do not know what that means. One of the most important lamas, and the lamas are like the priests in Mongolian Buddhism. The Budin Zovlul has many aims to fix Mongolian society, one of which reforming the army. So they want to recruit from the monasteries and make the army a religious force. Now, they end the Russian influence, they prosecute non-Buddhists, they empower the monasteries, and they declare the theocratic state. After that, one path is militant Buddhism, which is, again, recruiting from monasteries because fuck yes. And on the other side, their kind of brand of welfare, from the church. Obviously, monastery aid programs and that kind of stuff. Construct more monasteries because, of course, that's what you want to have. And then the central part is about, purging everyone who's not a Buddhist from society. Because, of course. And one thing that they can do is obviously ally up with Tibet, because why the hell not? Why the hell not? So yeah. After purging any officers who are against Mongolia, they can be replaced by trained officer lamas, fucking warrior monks. Like, who would not want this, Another problem facing the nation is poverty, blah, blah, blah. Buddhism is not the only religion in Mongolia. Some follow traditional shamanistic religions, while others follow other religions entirely. Not the least of which Orthodox Christianity in the Russian community, and most likely some form of Taoism in Chinese communities. The government can choose to either, probably some Islam as well, can choose to either completely ban these religions or develop their teachings to fit more into Buddhist society. So you can harmonize everyone else and syncretically take over everyone. Although they have trouble, they will have trouble dealing with the wealth of the aristocrats against them, the Buddhist Zovlul have the support of the poor Arats who hold Buddhism as a key part of the culture. So they essentially mob rule the aristocrats. So there we go. That's the end of most of the progress report. Mongolia is a very poorly developed nation. It lacks much in the way of industry and proper military doctrine. Most military policy is decided by whatever government takes power, but this industry is generally the same across the board. So yeah, it's very, very, limited, and it's just aimed at just kind of surviving, because in real life Mongolia did experience some levels again of economic development, but they were mostly supported by the Soviet Union, and the Mongolian army itself was equipped with Soviet weapons. So basically, it was a subsidiary of the Soviet economy and military. Trying to do everything by yourself, you're gonna have to rely on, you know, Mongolian traditions or whatever. All of the government types will have the same general ideas of foreign policy. Pan-Mongolism, again, the idea to reunite all the Mongols under one banner. Foreign policy is to be done through decisions. There is a specific war that includes Mongolia as a key player, but that is a rather large scale, so it will be covered in its own minor Monday in the future when more nations have been shown off. So we have no idea what the fuck's going on with that. So yeah, that's the end of that. That's Mongolia. Very interesting, obviously, because of all the interactions that are going to be around with China, most likely, and because of, you know, the whole nation offering a glimpse into a society that is long lost to history. Well, not entirely lost, but definitely to the modern world. You know, we have no fucking idea of this stuff. So yeah, it's gonna be a unique whole experience, most likely. So I do want to thank you all for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed. I hope that you understood something, and I'll see you soon.